Now, does anybody here use Windows and hate those cryptic error messages you get? Okay. Well, one company has decided to do something about it. Now, I don't know if you've seen those new Sony Vaios. They're just 1 inch thick, only 3 pounds. They're really cool notebooks. Well, Sony has decided to rewrite all their error messages. Now, because they're a Japanese company, they've decided to do them in haiku. So these are the error messages you could expect if you get a new Sony Vaio. If I can just find it. There we go. A file that big, it must be very useful, but now it is gone. Yesterday it worked. Today it is not working. Windows is like that. 3 things are certain: death, taxes, and lost data. Guess which has occurred? Chaos reigns within. Reflect, repent, reboot. Order shall return. So we're going to have some fun today. We're going to be looking at this material, which is called Blindsided, from a new book. And everyone will get a copy as long as you hand in your evaluation of today's session. So a free 20-pound book, compliments of BT, and I'll be happy to sign them during as you're leaving the event. I really want to start by asking this question: can an organization appear to be healthy and yet actually be dead? So could you go to some organization, measure all the vital signs, and have the business apparently be healthy, and yet could the business actually be dead? And to answer that question, think about when you learn to drive. When I learned to drive, I was taught to keep 10 feet of distance for every 10 miles an hour from the car in front of me, so that at 60 miles an hour, I'd have 60 feet of distance from the vehicle in front of me. Imagine a driver on the motorway at 60 miles an hour, but all of a sudden a fog descends so the driver can only see 10 feet out in front. If at that very moment you were to measure the vital signs of both the driver and the car, you'd find both were healthy. But I argue they're technically dead. They just may or may not know it yet. And really, it's a metaphor for our organizations today. We used to have stable markets, predictable customers. We used to have 5- and 10-year strategic plans. But now, all that is changing. Now, if you are actually driving at 60 miles an hour with 10 feet of visibility, there are 2 things you can do. One is slow down to 10 miles an hour. But can we slow down in our companies? The other thing you can do is, if you can somehow increase your recognition and response to change 6-fold, you can safely drive with only 10 feet of visibility. So the key is, for organizations today, how do we increase the rate at which we recognize and respond to change? Now, Blindsided affects all organizations. Think about how Polaroid in 2001 filed for bankruptcy. The company that came to define what instant photography was blindsided by the rapid rise of digital photography. Or I love to talk about how an 18-year-old has decimated the profitability of a $40 billion industry. Sean Fanning, by releasing Napster, has changed forever the way music will be distributed. Now, some people will say, well, the music industry killed Napster in court. And yes, they actually did. But I would challenge you to remember your Greek mythology. The myth of the Hydra is, when you cut off the Hydra's head, 6 new heads spring up. And the day after Napster died in court, 90 new file-sharing services sprung up. And over the next 6 months, they consolidated. And 6 months after Napster died, the top 4 file-sharing services were facilitating more file transfers than Napster had at its peak. And it's settled in at about 3 billion files a month are being changed across the internet. In fact, the recording industry this year estimates that they're going to lose $4.5 billion due to file sharing. When an 18-year-old can decimate the profitability of your industry by $4.5 billion, something is happening. So we're going to be looking at questions today, such as, why are organizations being blindsided? What are the laws that guarantee this phenomenon will accelerate? How can we identify early warning signs? How can we prevent ourselves and our industries from being blindsided? And then, as in many of the martial arts, what we learn defensively can also be used offensively. So knowing all these principles, how could we blindside our competition? So that's what we'll be focusing on today. One of the reasons organizations are being blindsided is the rate of change. Here's how long it took for different technologies to reach 1/4 of the North American households. It took electricity 46 years, the car 44, phone 35, TV 26, PC 15, cell phone 13, the web less than 7 years. And once the web is in place, it becomes the digital infrastructure which allows something I call flash pointing to occur. And we'll talk about this later. Another way to look at this is how long did it take for different technologies to reach their 10 millionth customer? Well, it took radio 20 years, 240 months. It took TV 10 years. It took Netscape 28 months. It took Hotmail 18 months. And it took Napster only 9 months. This is the phenomena of flash pointing. Once the web is in place, changes within an industry can occur actually very quickly. Now, someone here might say to me, Jim, the examples you've used so far deal with technology. Does the phenomena of blindsiding affect all organizations? For the first time in 50 years, sales of chocolate bars fell here in the UK. And who was the culprit? What did it to the chocolate bar makers? Was it the sweet makers? No, their sales fell too. Was it the crisp makers? No. What was it? Well, kids today, the rage is SMS, where you send short text messages to your friends on your mobile. Kids as young as 8 and 9 own cell phones today, and they send emails to their friends on their mobiles. And kids have limited discretionary income, so they're choosing to buy a £5 top-up pay-as-you-go card for their mobile rather than buying a Kit Kat or a Mars bar. Now, if you and I were executives in the strategic planning session for the chocolate bar makers, do you think we'd be looking at the cell phone companies as our competitors? No. You see, the chocolate bar makers were blindsided. It applies to all organizations. Let's just actually look at Napster's growth. Napster, as I mentioned, was created by this 18-year-old, Sean Fanning. The program was released to just 10 of his friends, and they were so excited about it, they told their friends, who downloaded it and began using it. So in late August, he released this program. By November, there were 1 million people who had downloaded the software. By February, 5 million. April, 10 million. By June, 15 million. By July, 20 million. It was this point the Recording Industry Association of America began their legal suit to shut down Napster. And what was the net effect? They doubled the number of users downloading the software in the course of a single month. In other words, the publicity around the lawsuit drove the very phenomena that they were seeking to kill. And by February of 2001, when Napster died in court, 62 million people had downloaded the software. And so, while the recording industry thought they were successful by killing Napster in court, the next generation of peer-to-peer file sharing services changed the rules of the game again. Because now I can download entire movies the day after they're released in film theaters. Why? You know, the day after Harry Potter is in film theaters, I could download it in its entirety. Why? Because some kid with a digital handheld camera has gone into the movie theater with a tripod, set it up, and filmed Harry Potter, and then uploaded it onto the internet. And the reason you can tell this is the case is partway through the movie, you'll see this. That's someone going to get their popcorn and coming back. So it's not just going to affect the recording industry, it's going to affect Hollywood as well. Really, this is one of the lessons coming out of the Napster example. It is easier to step on a dragon's egg than it is to step on a dragon. When some new trend is emerging that could potentially change our company or our industry, it's better to get in on the ground floor than to wait until the trend overwhelms us. Another way of looking at it If the rate of external change exceeds the rate of internal change, disaster is imminent. We need to be continually looking at how the market is changing, how customer preferences are changing, how technology is changing, how the nature of competition is changing, and align our internal systems and processes to take advantage of those. One, to avoid being blindsided, and secondly, to take advantage of new opportunities that we've never had the opportunity to take advantage of before. Finally, really what Darwin said is it's not the most intelligent, it's not the fastest, it's not the strongest species that survive. It's the one most capable of changing, adapting in a changing environment. I don't know if any of you have read Kubler-Ross's work. Anybody here on death and dying? If you're diagnosed with a fatal illness, a cancer, or your spouse is, you will go through these 5 emotional stages: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and finally acceptance. And constructive responses to a crisis only emerge at the final stage. But in fact, it's not just crises that generate these responses. It's anything that we feel threatening or upsetting generate these. Take something as trivial as locking my keys in the car. Honey, before we went into the restaurant, I gave you the keys to the car, didn't I? I can't believe I locked my keys in the car. Loser. God, please leave the hatchback open and I'll be good all week. And finally, time to call the Automobile Association. Now, honey, I gave you my cell phone before we went into the restaurant, didn't I? We go through these 5 stages, and I'll give you some statements from the recording industry and tell me which stage it indicates they're in. Napster is not going to make any difference to our business model. What stage? None. Absolutely. This was said in February of 2001 while Napster facilitated almost 3 billion downloads. These kids are pirates. Now, just a question here. Did anybody do this, or was it just me? Do you remember listening to the top 500 songs of the year on the radio at the end of the year with record, play, and pause pressed? And as you'd come out of commercial break, you'd take the pause button off and decide whether you liked the song, and if not, you'd re-cue it. We called that making tapes, right? The kids today don't make tapes. They just download using Kazaa or Morpheus. It's an entirely new world, and the record industry still hasn't caught up with the fact. I'm going to just touch on some of the laws that govern blindsiding. Moore's Law. Moore's Law basically says the CPU, or the central processing unit of the computer, doubles in power every 18 months, staying at the same price point. What's the net impact of this? It means that, you know those little singing birthday cards that you open and they sing to you? The raw computational power in that little card is greater than all the computational power on the first lunar landing module. Bit of a worry if you're an old astronaut. This notebook I have has more raw computing power than IBM's largest mainframe of just 10 years ago. You'll have that amount of power in your wristwatch in 10 years. All of a sudden, it changes the rules of the game. We will have something I call an audio user interface. In other words, like Jean-Luc Picard on Star Trek, we will talk to our computers. We will have something I called real-time translation. I will speak to my computer, and on the top here will be a little webcam, and somebody in Japan will see me speaking, but they'll hear Japanese. Universal real-time translation. Might that change the way we sell? Might that change where our markets are for our organizations? Now, I want to say it's not the technology that makes the difference. You know, I could have a brand new PC on my desk, but if I don't know how to turn it on, it gives me no strategic advantage. The real key is, how do we change personally? How do we learn to use the new technology to take advantage of it?